Welcome to the Global War Watch Network. Today, we're embarking on a crucial deep dive into one of the most defining global events of the 21st century, the Iraq War. This isn't just about, dates and battles.
No, definitely not. It's much more complex than that.
It's a journey into the complex web of political decisions, military actions, and, well, the profound human consequences that unfolded over 2 decades, forever reshaping the global geopolitical landscape.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is really to cut through the noise and navigate diverse sources, from classified military reports and rigorous academic analyses to gripping firsthand accounts and, revealing public opinion polls. We're here to distill the most important insights and surprising facts, giving you a comprehensive understanding, hopefully without the information overload.
Right.
Our goal is to unpack the multifaceted legacy of the Iraq conflict, from its controversial origins and the intense years of occupation to its lasting impact on veterans, Iraqi society, and, of course, international relations.
Okay, get ready to uncover the hidden layers of this pivotal period in modern history. So let's start at the very beginning, before the invasion even kicked off. What was the political climate and the landscape like in Iraq leading up to 2003?
Well, leading up to it, for more than a decade before 2003, Iraq was largely contained. It operated under a policy of international containment, which included stringent UN economic sanctions,
Strict sanctions.
very strict. And on top of that, U.S. and U.K. enforced no-fly zones were in place, primarily south of the 32nd and later the 33rd parallel. These zones were, well, ostensibly meant to protect minority groups like the Kurds and Shias from attacks by Saddam Hussein's regime, though Iraqi forces frequently challenged their authority. It was a tense, often contested, but relatively stable standoff, you could say.
Kind of uneasy status quo then. And then September 11th, 2001 happened. That just irrevocably changed the global conversation, didn't it? Many might recall a rapid shift in focus towards Iraq after those tragic attacks. What was the nature of that shift, and what was the initial evidence, or maybe lack thereof, linking Iraq to 9/11?
That's a really critical point.
Yeah.
Following 9/11, President Bush did, yes, order investigations into possible Iraqi involvement. But what's fascinating looking back is how quickly the intelligence community pushed back on any direct links.
Really? Even then?
Yes. Richard A. Clarke's office, he was the White House counterterrorism coordinator at the time, issued a memo just days later, September 18th, noting, and this is a quote, "scant credible evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks or significant collaborative ties with al-Qaeda." In fact, they highlighted wide ideological gaps between Saddam's secular Ba'athist regime and al-Qaeda's, religious fundamentalists.
Polar opposites, really.
Exactly. And the president's daily brief just a few days after that, September 21st, even suggested any contacts Iraq had with al-Qaeda were likely attempts to monitor the group, not cooperate with them. So the initial intelligence was actually quite clear on the absence of a meaningful link.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because despite that initial intelligence, the primary justifications presented for the war became the alleged presence of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and those, well, seemingly tenuous al-Qaeda connections.
Right.
What exactly were these claims being made, and what did we later discover about their veracity? How solid were they?
Well, the official rationale, the public case, was certainly centered on Iraq's supposed active WMD production, nuclear, chemical, and biological programs.
I remember the talk about mobile labs.
Precisely. You might remember President Bush, in his 2003 State of the Union address, alleging Iraq had several mobile biological weapons labs. Very specific imagery. And then in February 2003, Colin Powell presented to the UN, claiming high-strength aluminum tubes were intended for nuclear bombs and that Iraq trained al-Qaeda in bomb-making and poisons. These were the vivid, concrete accusations presented to the world stage.
But the reality, as we now know, was far, far different, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The later revelations were frankly damning. The entire basis for those mobile biological labs, for instance, came from a defector codenamed Curveball, Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi. He later admitted he lied, just made it up.
He admitted it. Wow.
Yes, and experts also quickly pointed out that the aluminum tubes Powell displayed were far more likely for conventional artillery rockets, not uranium enrichment. The specs just didn't match. Both U.S. and British reports later concluded that intelligence agencies had listened to unreliable sources, basically bad intel, poorly vetted.
So what did they actually find after the invasion? Anything?
Post-invasion, the truth became undeniable. They found approximately 5,000 chemical warheads, yes, but these were old, largely unusable shells from before 1991. Crucially, no active WMD programs or large stockpiles were discovered.
None.
None. It turned out Saddam Hussein himself had apparently destroyed his WMDs back in the 1990s under UN inspection, but kept up the illusion of having them. Why? Purely as a deterrent against his regional rival, Iran.
So WMDs were the main official justification, but there was this other powerful narrative running alongside it, the alleged connections to al-Qaeda. How did these two ideas get tangled together?
It was a very effective strategy, you have to say, for building public support for the war. While the Bush administration never explicitly stated Iraq did 9/11, they repeatedly insinuated a link.
Right. The implication was...
Very strong.
Yeah.
It effectively created a false impression for the American public. And the poll data bears this out. By March 2003, a staggering 45% of Americans believed Saddam was personally involved in 9/11.
35%, that's nearly half.
Almost half the country. And Colin Powell, in that same February 2003 UN presentation, didn't just claim Iraq trained al-Qaeda, but also that they gleefully celebrated 9/11. The reality, as a 2006 Department of Defense report later clarified, was quite different. Al-Qaeda viewed Saddam as basically a non-believer, an infidel. There was no religiously compatible cooperation between them. The narrative was powerful, yes, but the intelligence to back it up simply wasn't there.
So, given this lack of clear evidence, both on WMDs and the al-Qaeda link, what was the reaction internationally and domestically? Was there pushback against military intervention?
Oh, absolutely. Far from united. International opposition was significant and quite vocal. You had long-standing U.S. allies like France, Germany, New Zealand, strongly opposing the invasion.
I remember that. Freedom fries and all that.
Exactly. They cited the lack of credible WMD evidence and the findings of the UN inspectors, UNOVTICA, who were on the ground. The UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, went as far as to call the invasion illegal under international law in September 2004.
Illegal under international law. Strong words.
Very strong. And interestingly, Iraq itself, through various intelligence channels, Egyptian, Syrian, French, German, Russian, even attempted to engage the U.S., trying to discuss the WMD and al-Qaeda accusations, essentially trying to diffuse the situation diplomatically.
And what about here at home, in the U.S.?
Domestically, public opinion was complicated. A January 2003 CBS poll showed 64% approved of military action if necessary, yet almost the same number, 63%, still wanted a diplomatic solution first.
So support for action, but a desire to avoid it if possible.
Precisely. And you saw large anti-war protests erupting across the U.S. and globally. Even within the military establishment, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, back in July 2002, had apparently concluded that the existing containment policy was actually working.
Right. Public opinion here definitely evolved, didn't it? It became so charged, leading to those cultural boycotts and criticisms of allies like France. It was a very polarized time.
It really was. And it wasn't really until the summer of 2004 when it became undeniably clear that no WMDs were going to be found, that public opinion began to sharply turn against the war.
And Abu Ghraib happened around then, too.
Yes, the revelations of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in April 2004 played a huge role as well, severely damaging America's moral standing internationally. By December 2004, a significant majority, 67% of Americans, believed the pretenses for war were false.
That's a big shift.
A massive shift. It's a stark illustration of how information or misinformation shapes public perception and how crucial credible sources are. There was even a study on media sources that found, for example, people who primarily got their news from Fox News were 3 times more likely to believe WMD evidence had been found compared to those who watched PBS or listened to NPR.
Wow. That really highlights the media's influence.
Oh.
Okay, let's move into the actual invasion itself and its immediate chaotic aftermath. The invasion was famously codenamed Operation Iraqi Freedom. How quickly did this military campaign actually unfold?
It unfolded incredibly quickly. The invasion, Operation Iraqi Freedom for the U.S., Telic for the U.K., Falconer for Australia, began on March 20, 2003. It started with that massive shock and awe bombing campaign.
Declaration of war, though.
No formal declaration, no. A very formidable U.S.-led coalition force, over 248,000 U.S. personnel, 45,000 British, thousands of Australian and Polish soldiers, plus around 70,000 Iraqi Kurdish militia, the Peshmerga. They just swiftly overwhelmed the Iraqi army. Its resistance crumbled remarkably fast.
And it wasn't long before coalition forces were in Baghdad, right?
Astonishingly fast. Just 20 days after the invasion began, Baghdad was captured on April 9, 2003. And we all saw that iconic image of Saddam's statue being pulled down in Firdos Square. It became this global symbol of his regime's collapse.
A symbol of victory.
Yes, but what's often overlooked is that just 2 days into the ground war, March 22nd, U.S. forces were already encountering early insurgency tactics. Paramilitary forces, fighting Saddam, basically indistinguishable from civilians, were using AK-47s, RPGs, mortars.
So resistance started almost immediately.
Almost immediately. This was a critical early warning sign, really foreshadowing the kind of unconventional warfare, the insurgency that would define the next very bloody years.
So after this rapid advance in the fall of Baghdad came that moment of widely publicized triumph that, looking back, carries such deep irony, the mission accomplished declaration.
Ah, yes, the banner moment. On May 1st, 2003, President George W. Bush declared the end of major combat operations from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, standing beneath that now infamous mission accomplished banner.
Infamous is the word.
It was widely criticized, even at the time, as incredibly premature, because almost immediately following that speech, coalition forces saw a flurry of attacks begin to gradually increase, particularly in the Sunni-dominated areas, the so-called Sunni Triangle.
So the mission was far from accomplished.
Far from it. It was really a declaration of victory before the real, messy, unpredictable challenges of occupation and insurgency had even truly begun to manifest.
And those burgeoning attacks were tragically fueled by some critical, you might even say monumental, decisions made right in that immediate aftermath, weren't they? Particularly the disbanding of the Iraqi army.
This was arguably one of the most catastrophic policy decisions of the entire post-invasion period. L. Paul Bremer III, who was appointed head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA.
The guy in charge on the ground.
Exactly. He issued a sweeping order on May 23, 2003, disbanding the entire Iraqi army and its intelligence services, just dissolved them overnight. And this, coupled with the policy known as de-Baathification, which aimed to remove anyone associated with Saddam's Ba'ath Party from positions of power, well, it sent hundreds of thousands of trained armed men. Armed men. Estimates range from 85,000 to 100,000 Iraqis losing their jobs, including about 40,000 school teachers suddenly out of work. Sent them into the streets without jobs, without purpose, and certainly without any loyalty to the new occupying authority.
Wow.
U.S. Army General Ricardo Sanchez himself later called this decision a catastrophic failure, and it's easy to see why. You essentially created an instant insurgency pool.
That sounds like a perfect recipe for just widespread chaos and instability. What happened next on the ground?
It was precisely that. Total chaos. Mass looting of public and government buildings gripped the entire country. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, a repository of, millennia of human history, priceless artifact.
Irreplaceable.
Irreplaceable. It became a stark symbol of this breakdown. It was looted of about 15,000 objects. And later reports suggested maybe 10,000 of those were actually an inside job, looted systematically.
So not just random chaos.
Not entirely random, no. While efforts were made later to recover some items, U.S. forces were heavily criticized at the time for not adequately protecting these vital historical and cultural sites. This immense chaos created fertile ground for resistance and, importantly, the rise of new power brokers. People like Muqtada al-Sadr and his militia, they were involved in the initial looting and quickly morphed into a key resistance force against the coalition.
And key figures from the old regime were targeted too.
Yes. Amidst this turmoil, Saddam's sons, Uday and Qasem, were killed in a firefight in July 2003. And Saddam Hussein himself was captured in December 2003, found hiding in a hole during Operation Red Dawn.
Big moments, symbolically.
Huge symbolic moments, absolutely. But they did little, ultimately, to stem the rising tide of insurgency and sectarian violence that was really starting to engulf the country.
So that takes us from that rapid invasion into what became a much longer, much more brutal, enduring conflict. It escalated into civil war, didn't it, before eventually leading to the U.S. withdrawal. Let's talk about those incredibly violent years, say, from 2006 to 2008.
Yeah, those are particularly brutal years. The immediate power vacuum after Saddam's fall just unleashed these deeply entrenched sectarian divisions, Sunni versus Shia primarily. It led to truly widespread sectarian violence. There was an Iraqi journalist, Mithaq al-Khatib, who captured the feeling at the time, noting, instead of one dictator before, we have hundreds now. It really speaks to the fragmentation of power.
A chilling observation.
It is. And this escalating sectarianism just exploded into outright civil war after the February 2006 bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra, a major Shia holy site. That was a real flashpoint.
A deliberate provocation.
Widely seen as such, yes. Iraqi civilian deaths just soared after that. They peaked around July 2006 with truly horrific estimates ranging from 1,000 to maybe even 3,500 deaths in that single month alone. Just staggering violence. And then Saddam Hussein was executed in December 2006 after an Iraqi trial, a very contentious event that arguably further intensified these deeply rooted sectarian tensions rather than bringing closure.
This paints a picture of a society just tearing itself apart at the seams. How did the U.S. respond to this escalating internal Iraqi violence? Did the strategy change?
It did. The U.S. response was the surge. In January 2007, President Bush announced a new way forward, which involved sending a surge of about 20,000 additional soldiers and Marines, primarily into Baghdad. General David Petraeus was put in charge of implementing this new counterinsurgency strategy.
And the goal was stabilization.
The primary goal was to bring stability to Baghdad, tamp down the sectarian bloodshed, and create space for political reconciliation. Now, the surge did see a decrease in violence in certain areas. Part of that was attributed to something called the Anbar Awakening, where Sunni tribes in Anbar province actually turned against al-Qaeda in Iraq, who had become brutally extreme.
So some tactical success.
Some tactical success, yes, but it came at a cost. Tragically, U.S. combat deaths in Baghdad actually nearly doubled in the first 7 weeks of the surge. It was a complex, very bloody period. Some gains were made, but at a significant human cost for both Iraqis and coalition forces.
And eventually, other coalition partners, like the British, began handing over control to Iraqi forces, signaling a shift towards the Iraqis taking the lead, right?
Yes, that was always a key part of the eventual exit strategy. The British forces, for example, handed over control of Basra province in the south to Iraqi forces in December 2007. And you started seeing the Iraqi army itself beginning to launch significant offensives against militias, particularly Shiite militias like Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army in March 2008, operations like the Charge of the Knights in Basra.
So the Iraqi forces were becoming more capable.
They were building capability, yes.
Okay.
And this period also marked Iraq beginning to purchase significant amounts of U.S. military equipment, M1 Abrams tanks, F-16 fighter jets, indicating a move towards rebuilding their own national security infrastructure and theoretically achieving self-reliance, at least militarily.
Okay, so that brings us to the U.S. drawdown and the phase known as Operation New Dawn from about 2009 to 2011. What was the timeline for the official end of U.S. combat operations and the full withdrawal of American forces?
Right, the end game, so to speak. By August 31st, 2010, the U.S. officially declared an end to its combat mission in Iraq. The last combat brigades departed. President Obama articulated this shift in responsibility quite clearly, stating, "In the end, only Iraqis can resolve their differences and police their streets."
A clear signal of disengagement.
It was. This signaled a strategic pivot. There was an agreement already in place between the U.S. and Iraqi governments, the Status of Forces Agreement, which required all remaining U.S. troops and trainers to leave by December 31st, 2011. And they stuck to that deadline. On December 18th, 2011, the last convoy of U.S. combat troops formally withdrew across the border into Kuwait, marking what many hoped was the final end of a long, very controversial chapter.
But even with the withdrawal of combat troops, the U.S. presence didn't entirely vanish, did it? I mean, there was still a significant American footprint left behind.
That's a really crucial nuance, you're right. While the combat troops left, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and consulates elsewhere in Iraq maintained a substantial staff, reportedly over 20,000 people at its peak.
20,000? That's huge.
It's massive. And that included military personnel within the Office of Security Cooperation Iraq, the OSCI, whose job was focused on training and advising Iraqi forces. And it also included a very large contingent, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 private military contractors.
Right, the contractor.
Exactly. So a significant presence remained, but the mission shifted from direct combat to more of a support, advisory, and diplomatic role. It reflected, I think, the enduring need for stability and continued engagement in a still very fragile region.
And it's just impossible to talk about the enduring legacy of the Iraq War without addressing the devastating emergence of ISIS, or Daesh, a terrorist organization that would go on to redefine the global threat landscape.
Indeed. It's a tragic part of the legacy. The seeds of ISIS, or Daesh as it's also known, can be directly traced back to al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. That was the group founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. AQI really exploded in strength and influence precisely because of the power vacuum and the escalating sectarian tensions that were a direct consequence of the post-invasion environment. The chaos was fertile ground.
They exploited the instability.
Completely. ISIS exploited the breakdown of order, the deep sectarian divisions, particularly between Sunnis and the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad, and later the chaos of the Syrian civil war to take over vast swaths of both Iraq and Syria. They created this brutal, self-proclaimed caliphate and demonstrated the truly fractured, unforeseen, and incredibly tragic legacy of the initial invasion and its chaotic aftermath.
So let's turn now to these profound and lasting legacies, starting with the immense human cost for veterans, particularly those returning home. We often hear about the physical wounds of war, but what about the invisible wounds, the psychological toll that can linger for years, even decades?
This is an often overlooked but absolutely critical aspect of the war's legacy. A huge number, over 1 million U.S. service members deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan over those years, and many returned with incredibly complex physical and mental wounds. We're talking about traumatic brain injury, TBI, often from IED blasts, post-traumatic stress, PTS, depression, and also particularly challenging concepts like moral injuries, the psychological impact of witnessing or participating in events that violate one's own moral code, and complicated survivor guilt.
These aren't like broken bones, are they? They don't just heal on a set timeline.
Exactly. These are often called invisible wounds, precisely because they aren't always obvious, and they can resurface months or even years after returning home. They can be exacerbated by things like isolation, stress, or the loss of that profound group connection, the camaraderie they experienced in combat. Ron Hirschberg from Home Base, a veteran support organization, has spoken about this. We saw similar delayed symptoms in Vietnam veterans, didn't we? Sometimes decades later, maybe triggered by retirement or another life event. It underscores the really long-term nature of these struggles.
That's a truly sobering thought. And the statistics related to this, particularly around veteran suicide, are just deeply alarming. They paint a picture of an ongoing tragedy long after the deployments end.
They are heartbreaking, frankly. Between 2015 and 2020 alone, there was a staggering 40% increase in suicides among active duty service members. Among the broader veteran population, an average of 20 suicides occur every single day.
20 a day.
20 a day. And perhaps most tragically, looking specifically at the post-9/11 generation, over 30,000 veterans from Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom are estimated to have died by suicide in the past 2 decades. That's far more than died in combat in those wars.
More than died in combat.
Yes, and since 9/11, the total number of deaths by suicide among all era veterans has exceeded 125,000. These aren't just statistics. They reveal an immense ongoing mental health crisis. It's a profound, often overlooked cost of modern conflict, a kind of silent epidemic of self-inflicted wounds back home.
What kind of help is available? What are some of the approaches to care and recovery for these conditions? And what's the wider impact on families and communities?
Well, recovery is really seen as a process, not necessarily a cure. It's more akin to managing a chronic condition like diabetes. Standard evidence-based treatments include things like prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy for PTS, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression and anxiety. For TBI, specialized cognitive rehabilitation and physical or vestibular therapy are crucial. What's encouraging, though, is that newer, innovative approaches are also being explored. Things like the therapeutic use of psychedelics under controlled conditions, virtual reality exposure therapy for PTS, and also holistic wellness efforts, art therapy, music therapy, mindfulness, which can help manage stress and improve overall well-being.
A multifaceted approach seems necessary.
Absolutely. But we also have to acknowledge the immense burden this places on families. They often become the primary caregivers for injured service members, both physically and mentally. And research shows that veteran families experience higher rates of their own mental health problems, substance dependence, higher divorce rates, and even, tragically, higher rates of child abuse or neglect. It's a ripple effect that touches entire families and communities.
Let's shift focus back to Iraq itself. Beyond the immediate conflict, what have been the devastating and ongoing challenges for Iraqi society?
The consequences for Iraq have been profound and long-lasting. The invasion triggered multiple waves of large-scale displacement, a massive humanitarian crisis. The number of internally displaced persons, IDPs, people forced from their homes but still within Iraq, went from basically 0 in 2003 to 2.6 million by 2007.
2.6 million.
Huge numbers. And even as of 2022, there were still over 345,000 Iraqi refugees registered globally, mostly seeking safety in nearby countries like Jordan and Syria, but also further afield in Germany and elsewhere. The war also left deep scars on Iraq's irreplaceable cultural heritage and its vital education system. Archaeological sites suffered extensive damage and looting, often described as much harder to quantify than just the museum losses because it involved unexcavated sites being plundered.
Like Babylon.
Exactly. There was controversy over the construction of a helicopter landing pad by coalition forces right on the ruins of ancient Babylon, which directly damaged the site. Vibrations from military vehicles reportedly led to collapses of ancient walls. It's an irreversible loss of global cultural history.
And the impact on education, the foundation for the future.
Also severe, education was profoundly impacted. A 2003 Ministry of Education survey, conducted shortly after the invasion, found that a staggering 80% of secondary schools in the country were moderately or severely damaged.
80%.
80%.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps even more tragically, many academics, professors, intellectuals either fled the country, a brain drain, or worse, were systematically targeted, killed, or assassinated after the invasion. Recovering from that loss of intellectual capital is incredibly difficult for any nation.
And beyond the human and cultural cost, there's the environment. What were the environmental consequences of the war?
Significant and long-term. You had massive oil spills. Estimates suggest over 130 million gallons leaked into the environment, affecting vital ecosystems like Sawa Lake. You also had monumental carbon emissions, particularly in 2003 from the burning of oil fields, set alight during the conflict. Estimates are around 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent released just from that.
And the munitions used, depleted uranium was mentioned.
Yes, depleted uranium, or DU. Between 1,000 and 2,000 tons of DU munitions were fired by coalition forces, mainly the U.S. This led to widespread radioactive contamination in some areas, raising concerns about long-term health effects and severely impacting soil quality and crop growth, which affects agriculture and food security.
And industrial sites.
Adding to that, more than 250 chemical plants and armament factories were destroyed during the conflict and its aftermath, often leading to the leakage of hazardous chemicals directly into water resources, rivers, groundwater. This widespread pollution has severely impacted freshwater ecosystems, contributing to loss of species, contamination of drinking water, and even potentially plant extinction in some areas. It's an environmental devastation with consequences that will likely unfold for generations.
So bringing us up to the present, what's the situation like in Iraq today, years after the official U.S. withdrawal? What are the main ongoing challenges?
Well, today there are still approximately 2,500 U.S. troops remaining in Iraq. They operate under the banner of Operation Inherent Resolve and also within the Office of Security Cooperation Iraq, the OSC we mentioned.
And their mission now?
Their stated mission is specifically focused on training and advising Iraqi security forces and continuing the critical effort to suppress any resurgence of ISIS,
Yes.
which still maintains a low-level insurgency capability. However, this mission is consistently challenged by internal tensions and sometimes rivalries within the Iraqi military structure itself. And Iraq remains quite reliant on the U.S. for crucial capabilities like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR.
And beyond security.
Beyond security, Iraq's economy is still far from realizing its potential, despite vast oil wealth. It's plagued by pervasive corruption, ongoing environmental crises like water scarcity, and a significant youth bulge, a large population of young people facing alarmingly high unemployment rates, which is a recipe for instability anywhere. Many sources, both Iraqi and international, indicate that ultimately only Iraqis can truly resolve these deeply embedded structural problems. An external military presence, while perhaps providing some short-term stability, cannot be a permanent solution. The nation is still very much navigating its complex post-war reality.
Finally, let's broaden our lens one last time and look at the geopolitical ripple effects of the Iraq War. How did this conflict impact other regions and international dynamics? You mentioned Afghanistan earlier.
Yes, the impact on Afghanistan was significant. The Iraq War undeniably diverted critical military resources, experienced personnel, intelligence assets, equipment, and high-level strategic attention away from Afghanistan at a crucial time.
When the focus perhaps should have remained there.
Arguably, yes. Many analysts believe this diversion directly contributed to the slow buildup and eventual fragility of the Afghan National Army and security forces, and ultimately played a role in their devastatingly rapid collapse in 2021 when U.S. forces withdrew. It's a clear, sobering example of how focusing immense resources on one major conflict can profoundly weaken efforts elsewhere. The opportunity cost was immense.
And how has the war influenced the rise of Islamist movements globally, and perhaps even more broadly, international trust in the U.S. as a global actor? Has it recovered?
Well, the war certainly continues to be used by extremist groups. It's often cited as evidence to galvanize support for Islamist movements across the world. Tragically, it serves as one of the most effective props to both radicalize and recruit, presented as proof of Western aggression, occupation, and disregard for Muslim lives.
A powerful retreating tool.
A very powerful one. Furthermore, the circumstances surrounding the start of the war, the questions about its legitimacy, The flawed intelligence, the fact that no WMDs were found, and the general perception of a lack of culpability for those who initiated all this remains a large stumbling block for international trust in the U.S., particularly regarding military interventions. Countries like India, for instance, which actually had historically strong ties with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, have often held critical views not just on Iraq but on subsequent Western interventions in places like Libya. It fostered a broader skepticism towards U.S. foreign policy motives and questioned the basis for future engagements. The erosion of trust on the global stage is a significant, lingering geopolitical shadow from the conflict.
We've navigated the really contentious origins of the Iraq War, witnessed its brutal execution and incredibly chaotic aftermath, and explored its far-reaching consequences on the health of our veterans, the very fabric of Iraqi society, and the landscape of global power dynamics. It's a truly sobering reminder of how complex military interventions can become and just how long their shadows can stretch, impacting generations and fundamentally reshaping international trust.
Indeed. It's a lot to take in. Thinking back over everything we've discussed today, all these different facets, what truly stands out to you from this deep dive? How do the justifications used for war, the way public opinion shifted so dramatically, and these incredibly long-term human and environmental costs resonate with your understanding of international conflict, global responsibility, and maybe the true price of intervention?
This deep dive was brought to you by the Global War Watch Network. If you found this discussion valuable and insightful, please do like this episode, share it with others who you think might be curious about these critical global events, and please subscribe to the Global War Watch Network for more in-depth analyses like this one. We also really want to hear your thoughts and perspectives on this complex topic. Please put your comments in the comment section below. We do read them. Until next time, stay informed.